Hello everyone, my name is Martin Kirk. I work with The Rules. We're a collective of writers, artists, activists, coders, thinkers. Basically, we're a group of people who want to address the root causes of global inequality and poverty. I want to thank Eloise and the team for inviting me to speak to you today. It's genuinely an honour and a pleasure. I've heard about roughly who you guys are in the audience, and it's, as I say, it's an honour to be able to speak to you. I wish I could have been there in person, but it was just a bit too far to come. In fact, this is a bit of a strange setup for me. I'm sitting here by myself in a room in Boulder in Colorado with a presentation in front of me and 15 minutes stretching ahead in which I've got to just try and make this good for you. Anybody who's done media interviews, I'm sure there's some of you in the audience who've done them down the line with an earpiece and just a camera in front of you. That's how it feels, only without the voice in the earpiece to keep me straight. I've only got the voices in my head, so I'll try to make this engaging and direct for you, but please forgive any strangeness that comes across. Okay, what I'm going to talk to you about is some of the work that we've done looking at the discourse on poverty and inequality particularly. Before I started working at The Rules, I worked for Oxfam UK, and I was the head of campaigns, and I did a lot of work working with linguists and cognitive psychologists and people like that to try to understand what's really going on in the discourse of poverty, try to break it down in a scientific way to apply the best academic and scientific thinking to this. Before that, I worked with Save the Children doing their high-level global advocacy work. So I've been involved in this work for well over a decade now. And what I want to talk to you about today, the title of my talk is The Disease in the Story of Poverty. On the first slide, you'll see these are the four areas I'm going to basically cover. There's the disease. I want to outline what I think some of the rot in the heart of the narrative is, then talk to you about some antidotes, and finally a case study looking particularly at the emerging SDG narrative, which is just starting to take shape in the mainstream media now, although obviously the process has been going on for close to 4 years now. It's only starting to get into the mainstream media now, and so it is a good time to be looking at the narrative and what shape it's taking and where the strengths and weaknesses in it may be for those of us interested in the sort of change we need to see to genuinely address mass global poverty and inequality. Okay, so this work comes as out of about 5 years worth of study on this particular discourse. And I would say you could break down at the core of this, there are 3 elements to the disease that I'd like to talk to you about. One is that when you look at how poverty is talked about in the mainstream arena, and this is really important to say, what we're talking about all through this talk is the mainstream public narrative. This isn't the lobbying agenda. This isn't the engaged political audience, and it's certainly not the conversations you'll be having inside aid agencies and NGOs and people who are highly, highly engaged in this. We're talking here about the mainstream public narrative. So when you break down that narrative, what you find is these 3 core components. There's a lot more to this, but these are the 3 I think is worth spending a bit of time understanding today. First of all is that mass poverty as a concept, and at the level we understand it to be, or is the general understanding of the level it is understood to exist at today, which is a long way from any specific numbers, 1 billion, 5 billion, 4 billion, none of that matters. It's that sense of how we feel it to exist, the scale at which we think it exists. That sort of poverty is divorced from concepts of the global economic system, which might sound strange to those of you who live and breathe this, because of course it has to do with economics. But if you look at the way it's understood publicly, it is not understood to be a feature of the global economic system. What it is about those people who have been left out of progress or left out of the system. And you could say this is the logic of aid and charity. Aid and charity are largely, in conceptual terms, synonymous. They both articulate the idea that the best way to help people in poverty is for rich people to give poor people a little bit of money. Now, at the individual level, that's £5 a month or €5 a month to this charity or that charity. At the national level, that's foreign aid. They are both logically, in people's how the world works logic, the same sort of things. And the only reason you can think of aid and charity as legitimate responses in the face of mass poverty is if you don't think that those problems are actually created or part of the system itself. They are to help those poor, unfortunates who are left out. Let's give them a little bit of a hand up, or even a hand out. Hand up, hand out doesn't really matter. It's just a little bit of a help because they've got to be brought into the system. So that's the first point, that it's divorced from the economic system. The second point is that development as a concept, and this isn't a new thought, but we found it come up again and again in the research we've done. Development itself is basically about making poor people grow from a level of conceptual developmental childhood to one of adulthood, and another way of saying that is to take them from a position of helplessness, where they are just floundering around in their own problems, to one of maturity, which has a very strong sense of more like us. And that's a more like us, both morally speaking and practically speaking. So more like us, practically speaking, means they live exactly the sort of lifestyles and lives that we live, or those of us who are fortunate enough to be born into situations of privilege, that we live with our iPods and our air conditioning and our jet travel and our internet communications and all that sort of thing, modern conveniences. Morally speaking, though, what it means is, because we live in a world where wealth and morality are strongly linked. So you can see this throughout the discourse. Ideas of wealth and ideas of virtue are very closely tied together. So this is where sometimes this comes out, and I know a lot of people will be familiar with this concept of the undeserving poor. This is an aspect of that conceptual link between those people who do well in life, who are morally upstanding and who deserve it, rise economically to the top. Those who don't fall to the bottom. It's a moral hierarchy. Sometimes linguists call this the moral order frame. And so development as a concept absolutely rests on that logic. And this is rife, it's riddled through the discourse. A third feature we're seeing, which isn't quite the same in character as the other two, and doesn't feature quite as strongly, but for you guys I think it's really, really important, is that we're seeing a massive loss of faith in particularly the big NGOs. And one of the reasons for that is because there's a sense that they have repeatedly overpromised and underdelivered. Make trade fair, make poverty history, we can do all these things, and yet trade isn't fair, poverty isn't history. And I know you might think, well, of course, that's ridiculous. We never meant that we could make it, we meant let's do it. It was an appeal, not a declaration of intent or ability. It doesn't matter. What we're talking about is how people have understood it. And so that's another feature of the discourse you want to really be careful about. So if you want to now talk about the sort of ideas that we can inject into the narrative to help counter some of those things, the first idea, the one we've got here, is that poverty is created. This is a bit of a Trojan horse idea. If we can get this into the mainstream discourse as a concept, as a logic, as a frame, an awful lot of other things can happen. First of all, it will act as an antidote to the charity and aid logic, which says, just to remind you, that mass poverty is about those people who've been left out of the system and has nothing to do with the system itself. So if you start talking about poverty as something that is created, what you're doing is you're activating a political rather than a charitable frame. And that is a logic that will immediately, instinctively, naturally, without any pressuring from you, seek causes to the problems, not just this instinct to help alleviate the symptoms of it. I'm sure you can see that a logic that seeks causes is a far more powerful logic than that which just says, oh, there are a billion children out of school there, let's put them into school. That's a charitable logic, and it doesn't go to the cause of why those children are not in school necessarily in the first place. A logic of that sort can just be ameliorated with here, if I give this some money, they'll go and build a school and it'll all be fine. And it doesn't address any of the symptoms, any of the conditions, any of the human agency and the politics behind it. So I just wrote a quick sentence here to give you an example of what that might feel like. We humans long since passed the point where we could say, it wasn't us. We must accept responsibility for the bad as well as the good. Mass poverty and inequality are monstrous creations. We created them, we can fix them. So it ends on the positive. You don't have to be negative about it. This isn't a negative story, it's a very positive one, but it's the logic you invoke. The other idea is that this is a very trendy thing, and I hope lots of you are hearing about this sort of kind of systems thinking right now. It's very positively something that's coming into the professional discourse a lot, and I think that's a wholly positive thing. But how we must focus on the fundamentals of the whole system. So one of the fundamentals you can talk about is measures of growth. So how do we understand growth and progress and development? What do those things mean? How do we measure them? Because what we measure, we respond to. So here's another example of how a story like that could work. The world is rich, abundant, plentiful. We don't need more. We need better ways to live together as part of the natural environment. When the measure of measures is GDP and that the objective is growth, don't be surprised when that is what the system will deliver above and before all else. Change that and you change everything. Leave that alone, nothing really changes. And this brings us on to the SDG narrative in a sec, but that idea of we've halved poverty since 1990, can eradicate it by 2030, that narrative doesn't allow space for the fundamentals of the system, at least the way it's built right now, and I'll come on to that in a sec. And the third idea to inject is to tell positive stories of radical change. And by what I mean by radical here is those things that address the fundamentals of the system itself and the fundamental concepts at the heart of the global operating system, not just a good news story of how 60 more children were saved from malaria over there, or those symptomatic, improve the symptoms, make the pain go away a little bit symptoms, but positive stories of change for the fundamentals of the system. This one I pulled from a website called Beautiful Solutions. Some of you probably know it. It came out of Naomi Klein's work and 350.org. I've got a link to it at the end so you can check it out, but this one is a good example. So when the Greek government announced the sale of Thessalonika's state-managed water company in 2011, activists from the occupied squares joined the water workers to propose an alternative to both private and state management. The resulting campaign, Initiative 136, proposes a democratic and transparent and environmentally responsible management of water by local non-profit cooperatives. Now, the reason that is radical is because it's invoking a different economic model, a fundamentally different economic model, in this case, non-profit cooperatives. But it's getting to that sort of level in the discourse, not, as I say, just talking about we put X number of people on medication over here, or we ameliorated that particular conflict over there. So that's the sort of thing I'm talking about. So I want to talk to you particularly about the emerging SDG narrative, because I think this one is riddled with all the disease that I talked about earlier. Just to remind you that this isn't just my opinion. What we did here, we applied linguistic analysis to 3 particular sources for this thing. The Secretary General Synthesis Report that came out at the end of last year, the major campaigning initiatives that are kind of but are kind of around the World Bank's End Poverty 2030, the Global Citizen and Action 2015, and the 375 mainstream media pieces that have been written so far. We did a search on LexisNexis, which isn't perfect but isn't bad. And we found this number between January 2014 and March this year. First of all, there's a lot of radical talk going on in the SDG narrative at the professional level, in the corridors, under the radar of the public narrative, and that's wonderful and great. But there are basically 3 ideas that stand out so far in the public narrative, and there's no surprise this is the case. One is that we've halved extreme poverty since 1990. The second is that we can eradicate extreme poverty by 2030, and the third is that we're getting serious about climate change. On that first one, though, first of all, the reason that I've put extreme in brackets and then the smaller font there is because you might as well take those out of those sentences, because in the mainstream narrative they get lost. What the public is hearing and what is actually coming out in newspaper pieces is that we've halved poverty as a basic concept since 1990. We can eradicate poverty by 2030, and we're getting serious about climate change. The logic that is being invoked with that story is that we've done great. Whatever we've been doing, we've done really, really well. and we just need to push on through till the end. So that's up till now, we've done great, and we're just pushing through till the end. And the getting serious about climate change is a slightly different thing. We can come to at a different time. So at the heart of this, the story, and actually this is when you need to dig a bit deeper into the whole kind of SDG documents themselves, not just what's going on in the public narrative, but it's undoubtedly that the core and unquestioned strategy behind the SDGs is industrial growth. It's to grow the whole pies and trickle down economics will get to eradicating poverty. So when we say the underlying logic is we need more of the same to finish the job, that's what they're talking about. That's the logic that is invoked, rather, in the public mind. More of the same is more industrial growth. More of the same is essentially more of the same foreign aid and charity-based narrative on poverty. And I think what that actually does, by basically more of the same, what it does, and on the next slide it says, because it's not challenging the narrative, and because it's using most of the ideas like aid, development, growth that are peppered through the old narrative, none of which address the core fundamentals, which I talked about earlier, you are activating and reaffirming that which people already believe. So you're not challenging anyone's conceptions here. You're just saying, let's push on through with what we know. So we're activating and reaffirming the dominant logic as it already exists, which is that mass poverty has nothing to do with the global economic system. It's about people who are left out. And this is the logic of aid and charity. It says that development is about making poor people grow from childhood to adulthood, make them go from helpless to more like us, morally and practical. And what a surprise, it's all wrapped up in this idea of another grand promise. 2005 was Make Poverty History. Here we are again. We can make poverty history. This time we have an end date on it, but it's essentially the same logic. Very interestingly, for this audience particularly, when we analysed all those sources, NGOs aren't being heard at all. They're not featuring the narrative at all. I say not at all. There were two NGOs we found who were noticed. One is Save the Children, and the other is Christian Aid, but that's it. And even they are at an extremely low level. By far the most powerful voices in this narrative so far are the World Bank and various UN voices and a few corporates, which is interesting. And again, this is, as anybody who knows what's going on with the SDGs knows, this is a feature of this process that is very different from the MDGs. The corporate voices are far, far more a feature of it, both behind the scenes and, as we're starting to see, in front of the camera, as it were. So I want to kind of conclude by saying that if what we want to do is get the public understanding poverty and inequality differently, we have to start injecting some very different fundamental pieces of logic into that discourse. One of those is that poverty is created. Another one is that we must address the fundamentals of the global system, not just the symptoms. And a third one is that radical change is happening everywhere, and so therefore it's possible. I think a lot of the time what we can do is we can fall into the trap of thinking that good news stories and hope are all we need to promote, and actually the substance of that hope and the core, honestly, the integrity behind that hope is not quite that important. And that's the only reason I can think why so many NGOs have been lining up behind the halved since 1990, eradicate by 2030 narrative. Because there is no way that any deep, realistic understanding of the data shows that the MDG process, which is what they say by we have halved poverty since 1990, what they're talking about is those people who are doing the SDGs. Well, most of that change happened in China, which was outside the MDG process and outside the UN process. So it's a bit of a fallacy to claim that we, the people who are designing the SDGs, have the credibility of having halved poverty globally, because it wasn't us, it was largely the Chinese. And actually in most of the parts of the world, certainly in sub-Saharan Africa, there's been almost no progress at all, and certainly on most measures. And we can eradicate by 2030 is an absolute absurdity, especially when you take the core economic model they're promoting. If you want to here you go. I'm going to move to our final slide here, which has some resources and samples about some of these ideas, how you can get them out there. But on that last point, I'll particularly point you to the kind of quote "eradicate by 2030" pieces that have been written. The work of David Woodward, an economist who works now out of UNCTAD, but also works with NEF in the UK, is particularly insightful on this, and we've written about that here. So here are some examples for you of how it looks, to give you a feel of how it looks, to talk about how poverty is created, how to focus on the whole system, what's wrong with the eradicate by 2030, both at a kind of a policy and integrity level, and how you can maybe think about challenging it. And there are also some examples of positive stories of radical change. I just got one today from Positive Money that looked about how Iceland is trying to reform its money system. Now, it's those sorts of ideas, reform of the money system, not 0.5 to 0.7% ODI for, percent for overseas aid. You can see the difference, I'm sure, between those two ideas. One is a structural reform, the other is a palliative kind of financial stream of money. And they're very, very different. And so that was one idea of radical change. The other, have a look at the Solutions This Changes Everything website, because they've done a wonderful job in trying to think about it. So we're continually doing research on the discourse, and if anybody's interested in the research as it comes out, ping me an email here. I will send out the findings as we get them. Right now we're involved in a very deep dive into the discourse of those 375 articles, and we're only just getting the flavour right now. Coming out in the next couple of months we'll have an awful lot more. So there you go, that's me. A little bit over time perhaps, maybe they'll edit it down a bit, but thank you very much for your time, and I really look forward to hearing from Eloise how the whole conference went. All right, bye-bye.